In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west, trying to reach India. He was looking for a faster route to its spice markets and its wealth. He landed in the Caribbean instead, and he was so certain he had arrived in India that he called the people he met Indians and the islands the Indies. When Europeans eventually understood what had happened, they did not replace the names. They simply began calling the Caribbean region the West Indies to tell it apart from the real India. India's reputation was so enormous, so central to how Europe imagined the wealth of the world, that a navigator crossed an entire ocean searching for it, missed by a full hemisphere, and the name stayed anyway. One country's reputation ended up naming two separate parts of the world. Those names are still in official use today. More than 5 centuries later, the map still carries the shape of a voyage that began with someone trying to find India. Spices usually get the credit for India's global reach. Pepper, cardamom, turmeric, cinnamon, the goods that built European trading empires. But that is only a small part of the story. If India could change the world by accident, imagine how much it changed on purpose. The answer is that you are surrounded by it. You used something Indian this morning? Almost certainly before you left your home. By the time you open your laptop, you will be relying on a number system worked out in India more than 1,000 years ago. India's influence on the world is too vast to cover in one video. So today we're focusing on 8 of the most powerful ways India has shaped the world we live in. Let's count them down. Number 8, your vocabulary. Start with your own mouth. You have been speaking English words your whole life that are not English at all. They are Hindi and Sanskrit, and most people have no idea. Take the word shampoo. It comes from the Hindi word champo, from champna, which means to press, to knead, to massage. And in India it is called champi. The man who carried it to England was named Sakhe Deen Mohammed, born in Patna in what is now Bihar, around 1759. In 1814 he opened a bathhouse on the Brighton seafront. He offered warm seawater piped indoors, steam infused with Indian herbs and oils, and champi performed by hand. He called the treatment shampooing. Georgian England had nothing comparable to it. British hair care in that era was built around powders and dressings applied on top of the hair. There was no tradition hair spa as part of grooming. The entire practice was foreign to them. Hospitals began referring patients to his baths. The people of Brighton started calling him Dr. Brighton. A Polish princess traveled to England in 1824 for the specific purpose of being treated by him. And this is where the word begins to travel. And when the first bottled hair cleansers arrived generations later, they simply inherited a word from India, a word that was never English. Then there is sugar and candy. Both are Sanskrit, sharkara and khanda. The process of crystallizing sugar from sugarcane was developed in India roughly 2,000 years ago. Then something like bungalow comes from Bangla. The word jungle, which originally meant rough, uncultivated land, also comes from India. Loot comes from loot, meaning to plunder. Punch, the drink, comes from panch, the Hindi word for 5, because the original recipe used exactly 5 ingredients. Cheetah comes from the Sanskrit chitraka, meaning the spotted one. Curry comes from the Tamil word curry, a spiced sauce, long before the British flattened it into a single label for an entire cuisine. There are so many words with Indian roots that it would be impossible to cover them all in one video, or even several videos. That alone shows just how deep India's influence runs. Every one of those words sits in ordinary English conversation, but none of them started there. India's influence didn't stop with language. It also shaped something we use every single day without even thinking about it. Number 7, mathematics. Now the part you cannot see. The numbers underneath everything you calculate. Start with the fact everybody has heard, 0. The oldest written 0 we have found is older than most people expect. It appears as a small dot in a place value system in the Bakhshali manuscript, a birch bark document whose surviving copy has been radiocarbon, dated as early as the 3rd century. Around the year 628, a mathematician named Brahmagupta defined 0 as a number in its own right and wrote down actual rules for how it behaves when you add it, subtract it, and work with it. Combine that with the positional decimal system, also developed in India, and you have the foundation for every calculation your phone, your bank, and your navigation app perform today. Calculus is usually credited to Newton and Leibniz in the 1600s, but a mathematician named Madhava of Sangama Grama, working in Kerala around the year 1400, had already developed infinite series for pi, sine, and cosine. Those are the core building blocks of calculus, worked out roughly 2 centuries earlier. His successors, in what is now called the Kerala school, kept refining that work for another 200 years and used it to calculate pi to 11 decimal places entirely by hand. The sine function itself was worked out by the astronomer Aryabhata in the late 5th century, centuries before it reached Europe through translations of Indian texts. Pascal's triangle was described by Indian scholars as early as the 6th century. They called it Meru Prastara, the staircase of Mount Meru. Pascal wrote about it in the 1600s, roughly 1,000 years later. Binary logic, the on and off system every computer on Earth runs on, has an ancestor in India from around the 3rd century before the Common Era. A scholar named Pingala was classifying the rhythmic patterns of Sanskrit poetry, sorting syllables into long and short. To do it systematically, he built a binary-style classification remarkably close to the logic inside a modern processor. He was not building a computer, he was studying poetry. The system simply happened to be correct. The Fibonacci sequence, where each number is the sum of the 2 before it, was first described by an Indian scholar named Virahanka around the year 700, again while analyzing poetic rhythm. That is roughly 500 years before Fibonacci wrote it down in Italy. And the Pythagorean theorem appears in the Bodhayana Sulba Sutra, a set of Vedic mathematical texts compiled around 800 before the Common Era. It describes exactly how the diagonal of a rectangle relates to its sides, centuries before Pythagoras was born. There is even a link to modern software. Around the 4th century before the Common Era, a scholar named Panini wrote the Ashtadhyayi, laying out formal, mechanical rules for how Sanskrit grammar works. Those rules were so precise and so systematic that modern computer scientists have cited them as a conceptual ancestor of the formal grammar systems used to define programming languages, poetry, ritual geometry, and grammar. And underneath all 3, mathematics the world is still using. Number 6. The tools. India's mathematics was remarkable, but its mastery of metal was simply unbelievable. Let's start with the object that still confuses metallurgists. In Delhi, there is a solid iron pillar built somewhere between the years 375 and 413. It has stood outdoors through 1,600 years of monsoons and heat without rusting through. Modern researchers have studied the alloy for decades trying to fully explain it, and some theories point to a protective layer that forms naturally on the surface of the metal. Whatever the mechanism, ancient Indian ironsmiths produced something that has outlasted almost every comparable object on Earth. Then there is the steel, that famous wavy patterned Damascus steel you have seen on expensive kitchen knives. The actual metal is called wootz, and it was being produced in southern India possibly as early as 300 before the Common Era. It traveled through Middle Eastern trade routes, picked up the name of a city it merely passed through, and collected all the credit in the West for centuries. Zinc was first smelted as a distinct metal in India, at mines near Udaipur that were active by the early centuries of the Common Era, using a distillation process so advanced that European metallurgists could not reliably reproduce it for another 1,000 years. In the 1500s, Indian craftsmen worked out how to cast a metal celestial globe with no seams at all. Modern metallurgists assumed the technique was impossible until they rediscovered how it had been done in the 1980s. Go back further, and the engineering gets stranger. Around 2600 before the Common Era, the Harappan port city of Lothal built what is believed to be the earliest enclosed dockyard in the world, a purpose-built basin for loading and unloading ships, thousands of years before modern ports arrived at the same basic design. Around 2500 before the Common Era, Western India was building stepwells. These were multi-story water structures combining descending staircases, bathing pools, and carved stonework, solving water access and public gathering space in a single design. Thousands of years before civil engineering treated those as separate problems. Indian bead makers were using diamond-tipped drills to bore microscopically fine holes through hard stone, appearing in the archaeological record many centuries before anyone else is known to have used diamond as a cutting tool rather than a gem. Around 3500 before the Common Era, metal workers in the Indus Valley city of Mohenjo-Daro were already using lost wax casting. They built a model in wax, coated it in clay, melted the wax out, and poured in molten metal. The most famous surviving example is a small bronze figure known as the Dancing Girl, among the oldest pieces of figurative metal art ever found. Jewelers still use the same technique today. Money got an early Indian upgrade too. Punch-marked silver coins, stamped with standardized symbols to guarantee weight and purity, were circulating in India by around the 6th century before the Common Era, among the earliest organized coinage systems anywhere. And in the 1800s, the Bombay dockyard built full-sized warships out of Indian teak for Britain's own Royal Navy, because teak resisted rot better than European oak. One of them, HMS Trincomalee, built in Bombay in 1817, is still afloat today as one of the oldest ships in the world. There is one more, and it is unexpected. Shellac is a resin secreted by the lac insect, harvested in India for thousands of years, and named after lakh, the Hindi word for 100,000, which is the enormous numbers of insects required to produce it. For centuries it varnished wood and coated pills. Then, in the early 20th century, it became the material that every 78 RPM gramophone record on Earth was pressed from. The entire early recorded music industry was pressed onto an Indian insect byproduct. Number 5. Your wardrobe. Now look at what you are wearing. There's a good chance cotton is somewhere in it. Today, cotton is everywhere. But thousands of years ago, people first had to learn how to grow it, pick it, and turn it into thread. The Indus Valley civilization was doing this as early as the 5th to 4th millennium BCE, making the region one of the earliest known centers of cotton cultivation. Long before cotton-powered British factories, people in ancient India were already turning it into cloth. Even the oldest known buttons on Earth, carved from seashell and pierced for thread, come from Indus Valley sites and are roughly 5,000 years old. And India's influence on clothing didn't stop with fabric and fasteners. It also shaped the designs everyone still wears today. Take paisley. That teardrop-shaped pattern you've seen on scarves is named after a town in Scotland. But the design itself existed in India for centuries, where it was known as butta or ambi. Scotland later mass-produced it and gave it the name the world now knows. The bandana takes its name from the Hindi word bandhana, meaning to tie. It is named after bandhani, a centuries-old tie-dye technique from Rajasthan and Gujarat that artisans still practice entirely by hand, tying thousands of tiny knots into fabric before it is dyed. Cashmere takes its name directly from Kashmir, where artisans have been weaving these ultra-fine wool shawls since at least the 3rd century before the Common Era. A genuine hand-woven Kashmiri shawl can still take months to complete. Calico is named after Calicut, the Indian port it was exported from starting around the 11th century. Chintz, the glossy printed floral cotton, comes from the Hindi word chitr, meaning image or picture. These printed Indian cottons flooded into England in the 1600s and reshaped European fashion so completely that England eventually banned some Indian textile imports to protect its own weavers. That is how good the competition was. Indigo, the deep blue in your jeans, is named after India, which was the ancient world's major production center for the dye. The plant, the process, and the trousers in your wardrobe all trace back through the same supply chain, one that once made indigo among the most valuable traded commodities on Earth. Seersucker, the puckered summer fabric, takes its name from a phrase meaning milk and sugar, describing the alternating smooth and textured weave. And dungarees comes from dungari, a coarse cotton originally woven in a village near what is now Mumbai, used for sailors' work clothes long before the word came to mean denim overalls. And this relationship never actually ended. Intricate hand embroidery techniques like zari, using real gold and silver thread, have been practiced in India for centuries. Today, several major international luxury fashion houses still send their most detailed embroidery work to ateliers in India, because the specific hand techniques required have never been fully replaced by machines. Number 4. Your medicines coming to the human body. Around 600 before the Common Era, a physician named Sushruta, often called the father of surgery, described how to reconstruct a nose using a flap of skin taken from the forehead. That description survives in a text called the Sushruta Samhita, and the technique is a direct ancestor of modern reconstructive rhinoplasty. Surgeons still reference his method by name. The same text describes cataract surgery. A curved needle was used to dislodge a clouded lens and restore sight. It is among the earliest documented cataract procedures anywhere in the world, practiced in India long before the technique spread across Asia and eventually reached Europe. Then there is diabetes, and this one is genuinely remarkable. Sushruta and another physician, Karaka, noticed that among patients who had sugar in their urine, some were thin and some were heavy. They described these as two separate conditions. Modern medicine calls them type 1 and type 2. They reached that conclusion with observation alone, with no laboratory of any kind, and they reportedly detected the sugar itself by noticing that ants were drawn to a patient's urine. Ayurveda, a holistic medical system built around diet, herbs, and lifestyle, dates back to at least the middle of the first millennium before the Common Era. Today, the global wellness industry, with its turmeric supplements, ashwagandha capsules, and herbal skincare, is largely repackaging concepts Ayurvedic physicians wrote down more than 2,000 years ago. India was also recording rainfall systematically as early as 400 before the Common Era, and using that data to set fairer tax rates on farmers depending on what the harvest should have been. It is one of the earliest documented examples anywhere of collecting data to inform public policy. And decades before Edward Jenner developed the smallpox vaccine in England in 1796, British observers in India documented an existing local inoculation practice already in use, deliberately triggering a milder protective infection. Historians debate where such practices first began, because similar methods appeared independently in several parts of Asia and Africa, but India's tradition was old, organized, and well documented by the 1700s. Number 3. The games. Chess descends from chaturanga, a strategy game played in India as early as the 6th century. It traveled through Persia, where it became shatranj, and then into Europe, picking up new rules on the way. But the bones of the game, the board, the pieces representing divisions of an army, are Indian. Snakes and ladders began as moksha patam, a game designed to teach morality. Ladders represented good deeds, snakes represented vice. The whole board was built to teach karma. The British kept the board, quietly dropped the moral lesson, and sold it back to the world as a children's toy. Polo comes from Sago Kangje, a traditional horseback game from Manipur in northeast India. British officers stationed there watched it, adapted it, wrote down the first formal rules, and exported the sport of kings to England under a new name. Badminton has an almost identical story. British officers stationed in the Indian city of Pune, now Pune, took an existing shuttlecock game and formalized the rules in the 1870s. For years, the sport was literally called Pune, before it was renamed after Badminton House back in England, removing the Indian city's name from a game it had effectively invented in its modern form. Number 2. Your mind. Yoga is not a fitness trend. It is a physical, mental, and spiritual practice thousands of years old, and today an estimated 300 million people around the world practice some form of it, most of them with no real sense of how old the tradition actually is. Karma, avatar, nirvana, all Sanskrit in origin, all now sitting comfortably in everyday English, describing ideas that had no clean Western equivalent before those words arrived. Mantra, chakra, dharma, and ashram followed the same path, a repeated phrase used in meditation, the body's energy centers, one's duty or right way of living, a spiritual retreat or community, all Sanskrit, all now embedded in ordinary Western wellness vocabulary. That meditation app on your phone and the quiet room at your office trace back through meditation traditions that originated in India. Google famously built an internal course called Search Inside Yourself, based directly on these techniques to help employees manage stress and focus. It has since spread to companies around the world. And then there is the one with the largest effect on modern history. India developed a specific philosophy of nonviolent resistance called satyagraha, which translates roughly as holding on to truth, and used it to challenge British rule in India. Martin Luther King Jr. later traveled to India to study this method in person before applying those same principles to the American civil rights movement. One Indian idea about how to fight injustice without violence went on to shape two of the largest civil rights movements of the 20th century on two different continents. And number one, your money. India did not only shape culture and conscience, it shaped commerce. For roughly 1,000 years, from ancient times until major deposits were discovered in Brazil in the early 1700s, India was the dominant and for long stretches the only known source of diamonds on the planet. They were recovered from riverbeds and alluvial deposits, especially around Golconda. Nearly every diamond that entered a royal treasury or the historical record before the 18th century came out of India, including some of the most famous stones ever cut. Then there is the check, which is much older than most people assume. More than 2,000 years ago, during the Maurya Empire, Indian merchants were using a financial instrument called an adesha. It was a written order directing a banker or treasury official to pay a specified amount to a third party. That is a check in essentially modern form, one person instructing a financial institution, in writing, to move money to someone else. India was doing this 2,000 years before the checkbook reached your bank. And then there is Nalanda. Nalanda University operated in present-day Bihar from around the 5th century until the end of the 12th. At its height, it drew thousands of students and teachers from China, Korea, Tibet, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. It was not a monastery with a few classrooms attached. It had residential quarters, lecture halls, temples, extensive libraries, and a highly selective admissions process. Students lived and studied together across Buddhist philosophy, logic, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and linguistics. That is why Nalanda is widely described as one of the world's earliest great residential universities. An international academic community operating at scale, roughly 1,000 years before that model became standard anywhere else. So think about everything we just went through. The word on your shampoo bottle and the Indian businessman in Brighton who put it there. The zero in your bank balance, the iron pillar that has refused to rust for 16 centuries, the cotton in your shirt and the indigo in your jeans, different categories, but just one country, and we almost certainly missed 100 more. India's influence on the world didn't begin recently. It has been building for thousands of years. From the words we speak, to the numbers we use, the clothes we wear, and the ideas that shaped entire industries, India's fingerprints are everywhere. And that's what makes this story so fascinating. Which one surprised you the most? Tell me in the comments. And if you want a part 2, let me know, because there is a lot more to cover. I'll see you in the next one.